I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding so hard that it felt as though it might burst out of my chest. The room was dim, only the faint light from street lamps filtering through the thin curtains, casting weak lines across the walls. I squinted, trying to grasp what was happening. Something was off. The look in the air, the strange silence, as though I wasn't alone. I turned my head towards the window and saw him, standing on the terrace, motionless, his gaze meeting mine, as if he knew I was watching. A cold wave of unease washed over me. My mind raced, trying to piece together reality from whatever strange moment I had stumbled into. It was as if the world outside the window had become a different version of itself, one where the rules didn't apply and everything felt wrong. I couldn't look away. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't imagining it. He was there. He was watching me. But why? My thoughts were tangled, the weight of his presence lingering in the air like a shadow I couldn't escape. I had to get up, get away from that window, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I could hear my own heartbeat drumming in my ears, and every moment stretched out like it would never end. Finally, I pulled myself together, pushing my feet off the bed, my body moving against its own will. But even as I stepped toward the door, the feeling didn't leave me. The cold stayed. The silence lingered. And in the back of my mind, the question echoed, louder than the silence that filled the room. Was I really alone? The morning light was soft, a dull gray that reflected my mood. I told myself the night before was nothing more than a product of an overactive imagination, a trick of shadows and sleep. Yet, as I sat at the breakfast table, the strange sensation wouldn't leave me. I tried to focus on the mundane things, the clink of the silverware, the soft sizzle of eggs in the pan, anything to keep my mind busy. But it wasn't working. Something felt different. Dan, my husband, was reading the newspaper as he always did in the mornings, his eyes skimming over the black and white print. Jake, his son, sat across from me, stirring his cereal absently. He hadn't been like this before, distant, distracted, almost watchful. It wasn't just the silence between us, it was the way he looked at me. His eyes lingered for a moment too long, studying me with a quiet intensity that made my skin prickle. A chill ran through me, and I had to force myself not to look away. I could feel his gaze like a weight on me, but I told myself it was nothing. He was probably just tired or annoyed at something else, yet I couldn't shake the unease. When I looked up, his eyes quickly dropped to his bowl, but the look had already been there, sharp and unsettling. I couldn't help but wonder, was I imagining it? Or was he really seeing me in a way he hadn't before? Trying to shake off the feeling, I forced a smile, taking a sip of my coffee. "How's the cereal, Jake?" I asked, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. He glanced up briefly, then shrugged. "It's fine." His voice was flat, neutral, but his eyes, they were saying something different. I turned back to my food, pretending everything was normal, but nothing felt normal. Every glance, every subtle movement from Jake made my heart beat faster, as though something I couldn't control was slowly taking over. Later that evening, as the house settled into a quieter rhythm, I found myself standing before the bathroom mirror, a soft light glowing above me. The reflection that stared back at me seemed unfamiliar. My hair was messy, tangled from sleep, and the gray robe I wore clung to my body in a way that felt almost foreign. I was struck by how long it had been since I had truly seen myself, not just as a wife, a mother, but as a woman. Someone desirable, someone with a spark that could catch another's eye. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clear. I hadn't felt beautiful in months, maybe longer. My reflection seemed distant, like I was looking at someone else's life, someone who had once been full of confidence and vitality, but now had faded into the background. The realization hit me hard. I missed feeling like that. I missed me. But before I could think too deeply about it, my mind betrayed me, pulling me in a different direction. A thought flashed, uninvited. What if I hadn't been invisible all this time? What if I was still being looked at, but not by the people I thought I should be worried about. I blinked, trying to shake it off, but in the back of my mind I could feel it. Jake's eyes. The way he watched me when I wasn't looking, how his gaze lingered just a little longer than it should. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something more intense. His eyes seemed to strip away the years, the doubts, the layers of self-protection I had built. A part of me wanted to scream, to push the thought away, but it kept circling in my mind, taunting me. How long had I known, on some level, that he had been looking at me this way? I took a deep breath, turning away from the mirror, hoping the reflection would fade with it. But I knew it wouldn't. The image of Jake's eyes remained with me, unsettling, possessive, like they were burning into me. And in some twisted part of my mind, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I liked the attention. Days passed, and the unease in the air thickened, settling between the walls of the house like an invisible fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted, something had changed, and it was becoming harder to ignore. I tried to go through the motions, making breakfast, cleaning, pretending everything was as it should be. But Jake's presence, his every movement, every glance, was always there, like a constant pulse beneath the surface of my daily life. It wasn't even the things he said, it was the silence, the quiet weight of his gaze, the way he seemed to always be just a little too close. I could feel him watching me even when he didn't say a word, and it was unsettling. This awareness, this sense that he could read me better than anyone else, even better than I could read myself. One morning, as I poured coffee into my cup, trying to ignore the thick tension in the room, I felt it again. His eyes were on me, and this time, it wasn't just passive observation. There was something sharper, something more deliberate in his stare. I didn't dare look at him directly, but I could feel his gaze on my neck, my hands, lingering with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I focused on the coffee, willing my hands to be steady, but they weren't. The heat from the mug seemed to pulse through my fingertips, matching the rising heat inside me. I wasn't sure if it was discomfort or something else, something dangerous and new. It was like he was seeing me in a way no one had in years. His attention had shifted from casual observation to something more possessive, more familiar. I could feel his breath, even if he wasn't close enough to touch me. It was like a force I couldn't escape, and I hated myself for the way it made me feel. Alive, yet terrified. I was fighting an instinct, something primal, a desire to look at him, to understand what this connection between us meant. But I didn't want to. I couldn't. I set the coffee down, my hands trembling slightly, and forced myself to face the table. But I could feel the pull of his eyes even then, like magnets, drawing me in. I couldn't deny it anymore. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was too close for comfort. When Dan left for his business trip, the house grew quieter, emptier in a way that left a strange kind of tension hanging in the air. It was as though the space had become smaller, and every step I took felt more pronounced, more deliberate, like the walls were pressing in. I found myself looking for something, anything, to distract me from the heavy, unspoken words that lingered between me and Jake. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. I tried to be a mother, a wife, but underneath it all, there was a force pulling me in a direction I couldn't control. Jake was everywhere. I could feel him in the room even when he wasn't speaking. Every shift in his posture, every breath he took, felt like it was meant for me. His presence was like a slow-moving current, pulling me closer without my permission. One evening, as I wandered down to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I was met with the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. I stopped at the doorway, hesitating for a moment, unsure of whether I wanted to turn around and face what was clearly there, him. But I had already known he was there before I saw him. Jake was standing near the sink, his back turned looking out the window. The way his body was angled, how still he was, it was like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I could slip past him unnoticed. But my body betrayed me, stepping forward as if it had already made up its mind. And then, he turned. His eyes locked onto mine, and there was no mistaking the intensity there. His gaze was no longer just a lingering presence. It was something forceful, something that couldn't be ignored. We were standing just a few inches apart, the space between us charged with something I couldn't name. His breath came in shallow bursts, and I knew mine was the same. My heart raced, thudding in my chest, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. He stepped closer. I didn't move, couldn't move. And then, with a suddenness that took me completely by surprise, his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft, almost tentative at first, but then it deepened, and all the thoughts in my mind scattered like leaves in the wind. There was no logic, no reasoning, just the electric pull of his touch, and my own body betraying everything I thought I understood. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just losing control, I had already lost it. Everything that had held me together, every boundary I had set for myself had crumbled with a single touch, and all I could do was feel the fire burning between us, knowing that there was no going back. The morning came too quickly, dragging me from the haze of that kiss. I woke with a pounding head and a deep sense of shame, as though the night before had been a bad dream I couldn't shake off. I rolled over in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened and how everything had spiraled so out of control. I had convinced myself it was just a momentary lapse, an impulsive decision that had meant nothing, just a fleeting moment of weakness. But when I entered the kitchen, I knew I was lying to myself. Jake was already there, sitting at the table as if nothing had changed. He didn't look at me at first, and I almost wished he wouldn't. But then slowly his gaze shifted toward me. It was a look that seemed to hold everything. The kiss, the tension, the unspoken words that hung between us, filling the space with an unbearable heaviness. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. He just looked, and it made my skin flush with both dread and something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I forced myself to pretend nothing had happened. I busied myself with the coffee pot, filling a cup, hoping the simple act would give me a sense of control again. But it didn't. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved about the kitchen, like a weight I couldn't shrug off. "You're up early," he finally said, his voice low, almost casual. But it wasn't casual. There was something in his tone, something in the way he said it, that made my stomach tighten. I glanced at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." He nodded, still looking at me with that unreadable expression. And then, after a long pause, he said, "Last night." I froze, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want him to say the words that were hanging between us, words that would make everything real. But he said them anyway. "I don't regret it." I looked away, unable to face him, unable to face myself. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the shame flooding me, but I couldn't make myself speak. What could I say? How could I even begin to explain what had happened, or why I had let it happen? "I know you're scared," Jake continued, his voice softer now, almost reassuring. "But we can't pretend it didn't happen." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will the thoughts away, to push back the tide of guilt and desire that had been rising within me. But it was no use. The moment had already been set in motion, and I was too deep in it now to stop. When I finally met his eyes again, I saw the same raw need that had been there last night, the same hunger. And a part of me hated myself for it, hated that I couldn't turn away, hated that I wanted more. "I can't," I whispered, though it was more to myself than to him. "I can't do this." But in my heart, I wasn't so sure anymore. The days after that conversation were a blur, a mix of moments that felt both impossibly long and painfully short. I told myself over and over that I would distance myself from Jake, that I would find a way to push these feelings aside before it was too late. But with every attempt to create space between us, it only seemed to pull me closer. It was as if I were trapped in a gravitational field, unable to break free, I kept myself busy, doing laundry, running errands, anything to fill the empty hours. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on something else, his presence followed me. Every glance, every touch, every time our paths crossed, I could feel the air between us shift, thickening with the unspoken tension. It was becoming harder to ignore, harder to pretend it wasn't there. We had become like two parallel lines, impossible to avoid, always just a breath away from crossing, and each day it felt more inevitable. There was no room to breathe without thinking about what was happening between us, no way to move forward without confronting the pull that had become so undeniable. One evening, as I sat in the living room trying to read a book, Jake walked in. I hadn't even heard him approach. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at me, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, pressing against my chest. I tried to act as though nothing was different. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile that felt far too tight. "Hey?" he replied, stepping into the room. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath the surface, something raw that I couldn't ignore. He moved closer, and I instinctively pulled back, my heart racing, but I didn't speak. I couldn't find the words. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. The space between us had closed, and I could feel every inch of it, every breath he took, every shift of his weight. I was aware of him in a way I hadn't been before, his presence filling up the room, making it feel smaller, more suffocating. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to pretend anymore, you know." I stiffened, my stomach dropping. "Pretend?" The word tasted bitter on my tongue, but I couldn't stop myself from saying it. "What do you mean?" Jake took a step closer, and I couldn't make myself move away. He was so close now that I could feel the heat of his body, the rhythm of his breath, all of it pulling me in. "You can't keep fighting this," he said, his words a quiet challenge. "We both know what this is, what we want." I opened my mouth to argue, to protest, but nothing came out. The words felt hollow, like a pretense. What was there to say? How could I explain that I was terrified, that I was torn between guilt and desire, between the life I thought I had and the life that was beginning to feel like something I couldn't escape? He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine, and for the first time in days I didn't pull away. His touch was gentle, but there was an undeniable force behind it, a pull that made my heart race in my chest. "You can't fight it forever," he said again, his voice steady now. "Sure. Neither of us can." And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The words hung between us like an unspoken truth, and I felt the walls inside me start to crack. I knew there was no going back. I knew that the line we had crossed, if there was even a line anymore, had already been erased. I didn't know what to do, what to say, but the decision had already been made. I could feel it, deep inside me, a recognition that this was no longer something I could fight. The contradiction inside me, my desire and my guilt, my need for him and my shame, had become something I couldn't ignore anymore. We were both standing on the edge, and I knew, even if I couldn't admit it aloud, that I wasn't sure I wanted to turn back. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of tension that neither of us could escape. The line I had tried so desperately to hold on to between Jake and me had evaporated, leaving behind a reality that seemed impossible and undeniable at the same time. Every word, every glance, had only led to this. There was no avoiding it anymore, no pretending it wasn't happening. We were no longer pretending that things were normal, no longer hiding behind the familiar routines of our lives. The distance I had tried to keep between us had melted away, and now we were two people caught in the gravity of something we could no longer deny, something that felt dangerous, but also strangely liberating. That evening, I stood alone in the hallway, just a few feet away from the kitchen, when I saw him again. Jake was there, watching me with a look that made it clear he knew what was happening, what was inevitable. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said it all. I could feel my heart beating faster, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision that hung between us. We were closer now, closer than we had been before. There was no denying the tension, no ignoring the space that had once seemed so vast between us. It was as if everything that had been building up to this point could no longer be avoided. He stepped toward me, and without thinking, I did the same. It wasn't a rash decision, nor was it impulsive. It was the quiet surrender of something I had been running from for so long. When he reached me, his presence was like an anchor, pulling me into a moment where time seemed to stretch, where nothing mattered except the truth of what we had become. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Every hesitation, every doubt that had been there before was gone now, replaced by something I couldn't name, but knew was real. His hand brushed lightly against mine, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between us, of the unspoken connection that was impossible to ignore.